Prayers by the acting leader of the opposition.
Morning, members. Let us pray. Almighty God, from whom all wisdom and power are derived, we beseech thee so to direct and prosper the deliberations of the Legislative Assembly now assembled, that all things may be ordered upon the best and surest foundations for the glory of thy name and for the safety, honor, and welfare of the people of these islands. Bless our Sovereign Lady, Queen Elizabeth II, Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, Charles, Prince of Wales, and all the royal family. Give grace to all who exercise authority in our Commonwealth, that peace and happiness, truth and justice, religion and piety may be established among us. Especially we pray for the Governor of our islands, the Premier, the Speaker of the Legislative Assembly, the Leader of the Opposition, Ministers of the Cabinet, ex-officio members, and members of the Legislative Assembly, that we may be enabled faithfully to perform the responsible duties of our high office. All this we ask for thy great name's sake. Let us say the Lord's Prayer together. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. May the Lord bless us and keep us. The Lord make his face shine upon us and be gracious unto us. The Lord lift up the light of his countenance upon us and give us peace now and always. Amen.
Please be seated. Proceedings are resumed.
Administration of oaths or affirmations.
None.
Reading by the Honourable Speaker of messages and announcements.
None.
Presentation of petitions.
None.
Presentation of papers and of reports. Report and recommendation of the Minister responsible for lands. The vesting of Crown land at Registration Section, Georgetown Central, Block 13D, Parcel 1, to Mirage Properties Limited, to be laid on the table by the Honourable Minister of Education, Youth, Sports, Agriculture and Lands.
The Honourable the Minister of Education.
Morning, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise to seek your permission to lay on the table of this Honourable House the report and recommendation for the vesting of Registration Section, Georgetown Central, Block 13D, Parcel 1, Part to Mirage Properties Limited.
Is the Minister speaking there too?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, a report of the disposition of Crown property has been prepared in accordance with the requirements of the Governor Vesting of Lands Law 2005 revision. I confirm that as required by the said law, the details of this land matter have been published in the Cayman Islands Gazette, issue number 19, 2017, dated the 24th day of February 2017, and in a local newspaper, the Caymanian Compass, on 1st of March 2017. Mr. Speaker, Block 13D, Parcel 1 comprises of 19 acres that is predominantly in use as part of the Georgetown landfill. However, 1.89 are a western extremity of the parcel, and it was severed by the construction of the Esterle-Tibbetts Highway, and accordingly is separated from the landfill portion of the parcel. The highway now forms part of the western boundary of the landfill. Mr. Speaker, Cabinet approved that 1.282 acre portion of the western severed part of Block 13D, Parcel 1, be vested to Mirage Properties Limited, company owned by Mr. Noel Bodden, as a part of the land exchange. 0.611 acre strip of the severed land adjoining to the highway will be retained by the Crown for drainage purposes. The land to be vested is landlocked and cannot be accessed directly from the highway. The land was originally zoned as public open space, but was rezoned to high-density residential in keeping with the zoning of the surrounding land. In return, Mr. Speaker, the Crown will accept the transfer of 2 parcels of land, namely Block 27B, Parcel 113, Block 27C, Parcel 435, both in registration section Savannah, from companies also controlled by Mr. Nalbodden. Mr. Speaker, Block 27B, Parcel 113 is a 1.03 acre seafront parcel which form part of the Royal Cayman Islands Police Service Marine Base at the terminus of Hurst Road, Savannah. It is registered to Unique Investments Limited, and unfortunately the government constructed the building prior to completing the approval process for the proposed subject land exchange. As well as taking ownership of this parcel, the Crown will be granted marine access rights over the private canal that connects the parcel to the North Sound. The parcel is a zone low density residential and designated as lands for public purposes. Mr. Speaker, Block 27C, Parcel 435 is a 1.65 acre seafront parcel at the terminus of Leeward Drive, Savannah, formerly registered to Grand Cayman Estates Limited. It has been developed by the government as a public dock and a boat ramp and associated car park. The parcel is a zone low density residential and designated as land for public purposes. Ownership for 27C, Parcel 435, have been transferred to the Crown in advance of formal approval to the proposed subject land exchange as a gesture of good faith. Mr. Speaker, the remaining lands to be transferred to the Crown and the land to be transferred to Mirage Properties Limited in return are included in this report. In accordance with Section 10.2 of the Governor Vesting of Lands Law 2005 revision, 3 valuations were commissioned of the land to be vested to Mirage Properties, 1 from the Government Lands and Survey Department and 2 from private sector property valuation companies. The valuers were asked to assume that the land is a zone high-density residential. At the time of the valuation took place, the land had yet to be rezoned. Mr. Speaker, the 3 opinions of values are as follows. Lands and Survey, 140,000 CI, JEC, 167,532 CI, and IRR, $349,025, which assumes access. The in-house evaluation adopted the correct area of land to be vested. The 2 external valuers were asked to value the full area of the severed portion in error, so the figures in the Chief Officer's report are as amended proportionately. Mr. Speaker, it is the opinion of the Chief Valuation Officer that the lands to be transferred to the Crown in return have a market value as follows. 27B 113, acreage of 1.03, market value 210,000 CI dollars land only. Block 27C, parcel 435, acreage 1.65, market value CI $36,000. A report on this matter was duly considered by Cabinet, and after careful analysis and consideration of the reports provided by Lands and Survey Department, it was resolved that the Governor approved the vesting of the Crown Land Block 13D Part 1, 1.282 acres to Mirage Properties Limited in return for the transfer to the Crown of freehold interest in Block 27B, Parcel 113, plus marine access rights, and Block 27C, Parcel 435. Stamp duty, Mr. Speaker, is to be waived. Thank you, sir.
Report of the Standing Business Committee, said opening the first meeting of the 2018-2019 session of the Legislative Assembly held in Cayman Brac and Grand Cayman, to be laid on the table by the Honourable Premier, Minister of Human Resources, Immigration and Community Affairs, Chairman of the Standing Business Committee.
The Honourable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I beg to lay on the table of this Honourable House the report of the Standing Business Committee of the Legislative Assembly of the Cayman Islands with regard to the state opening and first meeting of the 2018-2019 session of the Legislative Assembly, which was held in Cayman Brac and in Grand Cayman.
So ordered. Is the Premier speaking there too?
No, thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions to honourable ministers and members of the cabinet.
The Honourable Premier, suspension of standing orders.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move the suspension of Standing Order 23-6 and then 7 and 8 in order that a member may ask more than 3 questions in the same sitting. And, Mr. Speaker, that questions may be asked of ministers after the hour of 11 o'clock.
Question is that the House suspend standing orders to allow questions to be asked after the over 11 a.m. and also the suspension also to allow more than 1 question to be asked, or more than 3 questions to be asked by a member. All in favor? Aye. Those against? The ayes have it.
The elected member for Georgetown. The elected member for Georgetown Central to ask the Honourable Minister of Commerce, Planning and Infrastructure, question number 20.
The member for Georgetown Central, question number 20.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to ask the question standing in my name, number 20 on the order paper. Can the Honourable Minister say what happened to the previous graduated license program that the Department of Vehicle and Driver's Licensing had planned to implement?
Honourable Minister of Commerce.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank the member for the question. Mr. Speaker, some of you here will recall that while the law for the Graduated Licensing Program, law, the GDL, was passed in 2006, it was never brought into effect and therefore remains on hold. For this Honourable House further edification, a main component of the GDL program, Mr. Speaker, involves the DVDL through approved driving instructors or ADIs going out to the high schools and teaching students how to safely operate a vehicle in a controlled setting. However, due to resourcing, that is the increased demand placed on our driving examiners at the office, it became difficult to commit to continued visits, the last visit being in 2016.
Supplementary. The member for Georgetown Central.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the Minister for that answer. Does the Minister and his government plans to address those resourcing problems so that this plan can come into play, considering the amount of resources the Department of Vehicle and Driver's Licensing had put in place to implement this?
Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there are no immediate plans to implement the program or re-implement the program. We are still trying to build back the team at the DVDL from the period where we went through reductions in the civil service. And of course, we have had a large percentage of increase in vehicles being imported to the island. And so we are, if you want, a bit behind, although things have improved quite a bit recently in keeping up with the demand on the DVDL. So, Mr. Speaker, as much as I would love to say that yes, we will get this program back into the schools right away, I think that we are a ways away from that. But I will give my undertaking to the member that I will put it on our caseload meeting, on our caseload within the ministry, so that we keep it alive. So, and when the time comes that we have the available resources, we can try and re-implement the program.
The member for Georgetown Central.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And again, thanks to the Minister for his answer. Just a small preamble as to the reasons behind the question. The Honourable Minister allowed a conference, a road safety conference just recently. And in that conference, one of the international specialists that came to offer advice and instructions to this country in respect to road safety suggested at that conference that this type of program is the safest and best program throughout the world. Hence the reason why I asked the question whether the government intends to implement it. And I just want to say thanks to the Minister for giving his commitment to trying to get this planned program started again, considering the resources that have been put in by way of time and money spent, and it's not going to be shelved. So thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Minister. Clark.
The elected member of Georgetown Central to ask the Honourable Minister responsible for Human Resources, Immigration and Community Affairs, question number 21.
Member for Georgetown Central, question number 21.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to ask the question standing in my name, number 21. Can the Honourable Minister say when does he and his administration intend to bring the necessary legislative changes to the National Pensions Law that will give effect to the private member's motion number 12-2017-2018 passed on the 28th of June, the 2018 of the Legislative Assembly, brought by myself, Kenneth Bryan.
The Honourable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the answer. It is anticipated that the bill will be tabled in this Honourable House in early next year. Several important pension-related matters have been identified which require legislative amendments. As a result, the Ministry, in conjunction with the Department of Labour and Pensions, are reviewing the concerns with the aim of advancing those recommendations for amendments to Cabinet for consideration.
The member for Georgetown Central.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Is it possible, or was it possible, that the minor amendment to allow the private member motion to be successful or come into effect in law, couldn't that have been done separately than the other things that need to be done? I know it may be perceived as, well, you're bringing one bill today, and you're bringing a law today to be changed, and then the next sitting again, you're bringing it back again. But the reason I highlight that is the sensitivity of the motion, Mr. Speaker. This motion is a motion that many Caymanians will use for not being caught in a foreclosure. So my question, Mr. Speaker, and let me try to focus on what I'm exactly saying here, is couldn't it not have been possible, since that we've had two sittings of the House, or this is the second sitting of the House, since this motion has been passed, that at least because of the timeliness of this motion, could not that amendment been brought now? Because it had been something I think all members of this House would have agreed upon in the various different readings and stages of the bill process. I understand that maybe the government may be trying to kind of do everything one time, but that delay of time could be the cause of whether somebody has their house foreclosed on or not. So could not the government have brought that amendment within this sitting or the past sitting in Kimmerbrook?
Premier.
Mr. Speaker, there is a long line of
Amendments.
legislative amendments and legislation which the government's legal department are dealing with. This is in the queue. As the member will see, no, there were some 20 bills sent down here this meeting, not counting the ones in the previous meeting. So the matter is being dealt with. It is considered much more efficient for it to be dealt with as part of the overall changes that are being proposed with respect to the pensions legislation, rather than bringing it as a one-off piece. And even those are in the queue, the ones that the government is proposing. So I don't know if I can say any more than that, Mr. Speaker.
The elected member for Georgetown Central to ask the Honourable Minister of Education, Youth, Sports, Agriculture and Lands. Question number 22.
Member for Georgetown Central, question number 22.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to ask the question standing in my name on the order paper number 22. Can the minister say what is the Water Authority's replacement policy on road surface when working on public roads during repairs and installations?
Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank the member for the question. Mr. Speaker, the Water Authority's replacement policy on road surfaces when working on public roads during repairs and installation are as follows. The Water Authority itself has procedures in place for the reinstatement of trenches and pipeline repairs on public roads. The Authority follows its own published procedures for installation of potable water means, which includes specifications for the composition and compaction of the pipe bedding and fill materials in the pipe trench. The amount of compaction meets the requirements as set out by the National Roads Authority, NRA, in order to limit settlement. If the trench is located in the motoring road surface or road verge, a temporary surface finish of spray and chip is used to prior the final resurfacing. The final finish will use the same material as the parent road surface at the specific location. Beg your pardon. During construction of a pipeline, the temporary surface installation cannot be carried out until the new pipeline has been tested, disinfected, flushed, and put into service. The period of time for which this is the case depends on the precise location. However, it can be upward to 2 weeks per active section of pipeline. Mr. Speaker, prior to the final reinstatement being done, the authority will make regular checks on the condition of the road surface and maintain the trench level with additional material as necessary. If the trench is located in the verge of the road, the compacted trench is compacted with additional crusher run if that matches the existing surface. If the trench is located on the verge of the road where the chip and spray has been used, the compacted trench is compacted with additional crusher run pending reinstatement to match the existing surface. Upon the completion of the pipeline works, the Water Authority contracts with Island Paving Limited, IPL, to reinstate the road surface to the same finish as the existing surface and in accordance with NRA requirements. A similar process is followed for small repairs with coal mixed asphalt being used if required. Upon agreement with the NRA, this type of repair will be carried out by the authority using hot mix asphalt.
Member for Georgetown Central.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the Honourable Minister for the answer. Just 2 short supplementary questions. Can the Minister say who monitors the replacement to make sure that it meets the requirements just highlighted by the minister?
Minister for Education.
Mr. Speaker, I'm reliably informed that it's the NRA that does the monitoring.
Member for Georgetown Central.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the minister say if a member of the public or a member in the community has a discrepancy in respect to what was there before and what is then replaced, who would members of our community report to for that discrepancy?
Minister for Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, again, I'm reliably informed that those complaints will go to NRA.
Member from Newlands. Sorry, Savannah.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just to bring to the minister's attention, the area to the eastern part of Bordentown, almost Peace Bay going toward Breakers, where they fixed the road there, the speed limit sign. It seemed like they cut a track there and it never was leveled off. There's a bump coming down there to about middle part of Peace Bay, if they could check on it for us, please. Almost in front of her mom's house, a little bit further up.
Minister for Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you to the Honourable Minister as well. The Director has given an undertaking that they'll be happy to look at that to bring it back to a reasonable state.
Member for East End.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, most of us may not know, but the roads, National Roads Authority is absolutely responsible for the reinstatement of roads. And it is, that authority is given to them under the roads law and the National Roads Authority law. There was a time when we promoted the NRA doing all repairs. I know that there was this controversy over the cost. Have we advanced that anymore? I think that's the first question. Has that been advanced any further?
Honourable Minister for Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, I'm reliably informed by my able and capable director that the NRA has intimated to them that they do not have the time to do it. It's not a matter of cost.
Okay, Mr. Speaker.
Member for East End.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The next question is, I know the minister said that the NRA monitors these things. At what stage does the NRA do inspections on repairs that the Water Authority is carrying out?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the honourable member would appreciate, it depends on the extent of the repair, but generally speaking, the NRA does a preliminary inspection to ascertain the extent and the necessity of the repairs. There is an intermediate monitoring, but then there's also a final monitoring to make sure that it matches up to NRA specifications.
Member for East End.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I wonder if that applies also in reinstatements, those monitoring processes.
Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That same high level of monitoring occurs at anything over 100 square feet by the NRA.
Next question.
The elected member for Georgetown Central to ask the Honourable Minister of Education, Youth, Sports, Agriculture and Lands, question number 23.
Honourable Member for Georgetown Central.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Question number 23.
I stand to ask the question standing in my name on the order paper, number 23. Can the Honourable Minister say how are teachers compensated for time worked over their obligated contracted working hours?
Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, although this question, in my respective view, is strictly Section 55 of the Constitution, I will nonetheless answer the question. The school year begins in late August or early September and includes 185 working days, of which 8 to 10 days are normally allocated for professional development and planning. The post holder will also be expected to attend and participate in school events and activities, included those scheduled for weekends and evenings. Mr. Speaker, primary schools are in session for approximately 5 hours per day, with typical hours being from 8:30 to 3 p.m., with a mid-morning break and a lunch break. Secondary schools, Mr. Speaker, are in session for approximately 5.5 hours per day, with typical hours being from 8 a.m. to 3 p.m., with a mid-morning break and a lunch period as well. A full teaching load is 24 sessions out of 30 possible sessions in a week. Individual teaching sessions are scheduled by school principals and would normally include at least 6 non-teaching planning sessions as staffing levels permit to meet the needs of the student, the staff, and the respective school. The post holder will at times, Mr. Speaker, be expected to supervise children outside of scheduled teaching times and to ensure the safety of children after regular school hours until they are collected. The post holder is a civil servant and is subject, therefore, Mr. Speaker, to the Public Service Management Law and Personnel Regulations, and as such is expected to work 37.5 hours per week. The post holder is designated as a member of the school staff by the Director of Education Services and is subject to Schedule 1, Section 5D of the Personnel Regulations. In recognition that teaching duties and other professional responsibilities may often occupy more than the statutory 37.5 hours per week, Schedule 1 provides, Mr. Speaker, that teachers can have school vacation leave in lieu of other compensation. The yearly teaching schedule is set out by the Director of Education Services and is published each year on the school official calendar. In lieu of annual leave, teaching staff would require approximately 50 to 55 working days plus public holidays off in each respective year. That is summer, mid and mid-term breaks, as determined by the school calendar. An additional 3 days paid leave at the Director's discretion will soon become available. In fact, Cabinet approved it last week to teaching staff on an annual basis, which will provide some flexibility for staff to attend significant life events, for example, their children's graduations, that sometimes fall within an academic year. As with other civil servants, the standard entitlements to sick leave and other types of discretionary leave, bereavement and compassionate leave also exist and are applicable to our teachers.
Member for Georgetown Central.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the Minister for those answers. In respect to the answer, there's a sentence that says Schedule 1 provides teachers with school vacation leave in lieu of other compensation. What is the other compensation?
Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The following allowances are payable to those staff acting in other roles and undertaking additional responsibilities. Firstly, acting allowances where the employee is acting in another position. Secondly, duty allowances where the employee undertake duties that are substantially in excess of or substantially more onerous than those of their normal position. Multiple individuals across our schools will receive a duty allowance for taking on additional responsibilities. Subject leader, primary Synco, key stage coordinator for 1 and 2, math recoveries mentors, lead literacy, lead numeracy. They can also receive motor car upkeep for employees who undertake substantial travel in the course of their teaching duties, mileage reimbursement for the pre-approved use of their personal vehicles for official purposes only, and that's normally an ad hoc use for their personal vehicles. Those are the extra benefits.
Georgetown Central member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the minister say if a teacher has a discrepancy on whether or not they are getting compensation for time worked over their contracted hours, what is the process of complaint by way of structure? Who do they go to, and how is that dealt with?
Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, one would hope that rather than a complaint, the first action by the teacher would be one of request and clarification and or elucidation. If that fails, the correct line is the principal of the respective school. If that fails, then it's the Director of Educational Services, Ms. Monteith.
Member for Georgetown Central.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to agree with the Honourable Minister that hopefully it doesn't get to a complaint, but the focus of my question is because there are some teachers out there who have concerns that their matters are not being addressed in the rank and files of the complaint process. Just one more, or probably two more supplementary questions in this topic. Am I understanding that the choice of whether time in lieu or compensation by way of monies is decided upon the ministry as opposed to the employee's choice?
Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm reliably informed by my acting chief officer that there is not a discretion or choice. If it's overtime, then it's time in lieu.
Member for Georgetown Central.
Last question. If I retract that, Mr. Speaker. Thank you so much. I'm completed.
The elected member for Georgetown Central to ask the Honourable Minister of Education, Youth, Sports, Agriculture and Lands. Question number 24.
Member for Georgetown Central, question number 4.
Thank you, Mr.
24.
Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I stand to ask the question on the order paper labeled as number 24, standing in my name. Can the Honourable Minister say if there are any plans for the Crown property labeled as Block 14CF, parcel 140 in the constituency of Georgetown Central, and if so, what are they?
Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank the member for the question, the answer. The land in question is a small 0.02 acre parcel of Crown property adjoining the Teacher A. Macfield Community Centre located on School Road in the constituency of Georgetown Central. Historically, the land has been used as an informal local market and a car park. The government has asked the new Georgetown manager tasked with revitalization under the Ministry of Planning to advise on the recommended future use of the land, which will include but not be limited to consideration for the use of a heritage park.
Member for Georgetown Central.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the Minister for that answer. Can the Minister say or give assurances to those who have been occupying that location for over a decade now in respect to business ventures, that they would be given the security of being able to be involved in the future plans by way of a tenant of that location.
Honorable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Out of abundance of caution, let me state for the record that this government is not in the business of awarding squatters on Crown property. Nonetheless, I will further inform the House as to the current status of the situation. The land is undeveloped, as I understand it, with three small wooden buildings or market stalls. 2 of these appear to be vacant. The remaining structures occupied by seamstress, namely Ms. Modesta E-Bikes of Honduran National, now I believe perhaps possesses Cayman status through marriage. The rest of the parcel is used as an informal public car parking. A license agreement has been issued earlier this year to an adjacent business to locate a small garbage dumpster on the land, since it had no space on its own premises, and the Department of Environmental Health had raised litter and health concerns arising from the unauthorized dumping on this Crown property. There is no license fee payable, and it's understood that the licensee pays the Department of Environmental Health to rent and empty the dumpster itself. The seamstress, as I earlier referred to, Ms. Modesta E-Bikes, does not have a tenancy agreement to occupy the premises and is doing so illegally. It is understood that she has been in occupation since Hurricane Ivan in 2004. No rent has ever been paid to the government. The property has no running water supply or sanitation facilities, and we understand that electricity is being borrowed. At an inspection done on the 8th of November, Public Works Department found that the electricity source was from a nearby property and not from a government by consent. The occupant, we believe, should either be evicted by Lands and Survey on a 1 month's notice or provided with a temporary month-to-month tenancy at nil rent until the future of the site and the occupancy is decided. And we intend to speak to her with that regard to see what her preference would be. Preliminary concept plans was also done, Mr. Speaker, by Public Works Department early in 2015 on instructions of the Ministry for the design of 8 timber craft market shops, stall plus toilet facilities. Our preliminary costing was estimated at that time for $200,000, including the asphalt of the car park, which would be which would be an additional $25,000. However, due to lack of funding at that time, the project was not progressed further, but as indicated earlier, now that there is a town manager in post and the revitalization is a priority of this government, it will be under active consideration.
Member for Georgetown Central.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I want to say thank you again to the Minister for giving even further details about the circumstances there. But there was a trigger word that I heard there in respect to the word squatters. And I agree that the government should not indulge in allowing people to squat. But by all means, I don't think that the government was unaware of not only the lady that wasn't mentioned, but other persons who have been there for close to 20 years now occupying it. Because we've had authorities and officials from various different departments and communications with these individuals about a variety of different matters, including police issues. And if there was any concern of squatting, why wasn't it addressed before? But maybe I should formulate what my question is. I think that it is reasonable to expect that with the longevity of those persons being there, they don't have any right to the property, but a mere right to an opportunity for when the development does happen, which I am happy that the government has indicated that will happen in the future, and I hope they plan to have me involved in that, because it is my constituency. But for those who have been there occupying, that they're given, I wouldn't consider it a special provision for them, but first consideration or first right of refusal because of that long time of occupancy there, that many administrations before did not take up the opportunity to say if they weren't rightfully there, they didn't move them. So one would assume that that is acceptance of them being there.
Honorable Member, I understand this is a sensitive issue for you, but you need to turn your
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am asking the Minister for those who have occupied and who are currently still there to be given first preference in any new development there, as well as whatever development is going to happen, have me as the elected member for Georgetown Central involved in the development plans.
Honorable Minister, can you give that kind of take?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I think the fact that the government gave the option that we could go with this strict statutory liability of having them evicted and removed, or that they could remain there under proper month-to-month tenancy at nil consideration, which would not change the status quo as far as payment, but it would actually allow them or remind them that the Crown is in fact the owner. The fact that the government has gone on a limb to be willing to exercise that discretion means that they would also have an opportunity to go. But I wanted to balance it so that persons didn't think they could take up squatting on Crown property and use that as a beneficiary preferential right.
Just a matter of clarity. So is
Honorable
the Minister saying...
Georgetown Central.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So is the Minister saying, yes, this administration will be able to give those who have occupied that location first preference for tenant opportunities with that development in the future?
Honorable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the point to further clarify, I cannot anticipate that outcome until we receive an application from the current squatters that they wish to remain in a legal tenancy. Once that is done, obviously then I will take it to my caucus and cabinet and see if they're willing to make that decision. If the Honourable Minister wishes to assist the constituents, perhaps he would assist them in making that request to the government, and at that time we'll consider it.
The elected member for Georgetown Central to ask the Honourable Minister of Education, Youth, Sports, Agriculture and Lands. Question number 25.
Member for Georgetown Central, question number 25.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to ask the question on the order paper number 25 standing in my name. Can the Honourable Minister say what measures are being taken by the government to regulate property evaluators in the Cayman Islands?
Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you to the member for the question. The answer, there are currently no measures being taken by government to regulate property evaluators in the Cayman Islands.
Member for Georgetown Central.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A minor preamble before I ask my question. This Honourable House may remember in the first budget session that a line of questioning about the regulatory process of evaluators and the lack thereof it. And the Honourable Minister acknowledged that they are self-regulated, and I asked the question at that time, would her administration consider creating regulations to regulate property evaluators? And at that time, the answer was yes, she would take it to her administration for consideration. Is the Minister now saying that the administration is not considering that fact?
Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the answer remains that they're self-regulated. Consideration was given based on the following answer, and I trust the Honourable Member would come to the same final consideration we did after getting this advice from our technocrats. The government does not plan to regulate or license property valuers in Cayman. This is because property valuers are regulated globally by the professional body, and the government does not see a need to duplicate the role locally. All qualified valuers are members of the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors, RICS, which is a professional body that accredits professionals within the land, property, construction, and infrastructure sectors worldwide. Professionals holding RICS qualifications are required to have a minimum of a bachelor's degree and at least 2 years practical experience to have passed an assessment of professional competence. The RICS introduced the Valuer Registration Scheme in 2013, which became mandatory in Cayman in 2015. All chartered valuation surveyors are regulated through the Valuer Registration Scheme by the RICS. The Valuer Registration Scheme provides government with confidence in professional self-regulation and in their own public sector professionals. The RICS acts in the public's interest, undertaking regulation of their members, and therefore it is not necessary for government regulation, as this is already a key role undertaken by the professional body. The RICS is a global organization. It has its staff, resources, and expertise to undertake the necessary compliance audits, manage regulation, and ensure disciplinary control of RICS members and valuers. The RICS employs 120 staff and receives and independently investigates complaints worldwide. There are 15,000 registered valuers globally, and the RICS receives and investigates approximately 1,300 complaints annually. In 2016, 390 disciplinary sanctions were issued against members worldwide. The scheme was initiated by the members serving on the Valuation Professional Group Board as a result of the recommendation made by an independent review and by a stakeholder consultation process. Valuer Registration Scheme is a form of regulation providing assurance to users that our valuers are appropriately qualified and are acting in accordance with internationally approved valuation standards. The scheme encompasses a regulatory review scheme for members carrying out Red Book valuations, and it's mandatory for all RICS members in Cayman who are undertaking Red Book valuations to be certified as a registered valuer. Thus, all financial lending institutions and banks in Cayman have adopted the use of registered valuers when valuation advice is required. In order for a valuer to become a registered valuer, persons have to meet strict criteria set by the RICS. The RICS audits valuation firms and individuals who are part of the valuation registration scheme. The last audit in Cayman, Mr. Speaker, was conducted in September 2018, and all registered valuation firms in Cayman were audited to ensure that they complied with global RICS valuation standards. The Valuation and Estates Office of the Lands and Survey Department has an appointed valuation panel which it uses to undertake any necessary valuation work outside of its own merit. All members of this panel must be qualified RICS registered valuers working for the RICS regulated firms. There is an established RICS Cayman chapter board. The acting chief valuation officer, namely Mrs. Ruth Watson, MRICS registered valuer, is a member of this board. The board is willing to provide further information on how their members are regulated if the member so desires. The only person who has recourse over a valuation report is the instructing client. In many instances, this will be a bank or a lending institution. The valuer is contracted to prepare a valuation report for its client only, and the valuation report cannot be relied on by a third party. If the client, therefore, is unhappy with the valuation, their first recourse is to the person or the firm who prepared the report, as it is mandatory requirement of the RICS that members and member firms must have a complete handling procedure. It is important to note that if the client is simply not happy with the valuation figure, it does not imply that the valuation is incorrect or that the value has been negligent. Mr. Speaker, valuations are subjective, based on the valuer's interpretation of comparable evidence, and importantly, on the original instructions and in terms of engagement between the client and the valuer as to the purpose of the required valuation, as these will have a large bearing on the end value. All valuations produced by RICS have to comply with the RICS valuation global standards from July 2017. And Mr. Speaker, the terms of engagement from the financial institutions always stipulate that the valuations are in full compliance with the RICS global standards. Members are required to have professional indemnity insurance and a complete handling procedure. Clients aggrieved by inaccurate valuations can therefore sue valuers for negligence. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The member for Georgetown West.
No, Boddington West. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Through you, would the government consider the position when you factor in that we have people, there's a possibility that people can just walk off the plane and just start valuing real estate in Cayman, where many Caymanian wealths are tied up in. And what jumped out at me, Mr. Speaker, and you may recall this, is during the government's, I think, valuation of the government building, the value had ranged from 70 million to 110 million, which is more than 50% difference. And when you have valuations going so broadly and so widely, I think this is something that we at a minimum should at least, even if we have our own local tests or something, but have something in place to regulate these people. But I just don't see that someone can just crawl off the plane and just start valuing real estate in Cayman. I think this is something that the government may want to consider. And if the government would consider their original position, or at least to look into it.
Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, technically, someone could, in fact, walk off the plane, but they would have to have their valuation qualification. What they may not have is the experience, but I'm reliably informed by Ms. Susan Watson that if that is the case, and it's not frequent, the firm that it's registered would, for a minimum of 6 months, serve as a mentor, and they would sign for that person until they got the relevant local experience. Now, obviously, the question may be, why did that person get a work permit? That's an immigration question, so please resist the temptation to ask this minister.
The member for Georgetown Central.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The minister just said in her sum up that, Mr. Speaker, if I recall quite clearly, you said to me in the last sitting of this House, I'm allowed to have a preamble. Now, if the Premier has an issue with me giving my preamble before my question, please ask him to stand in a point of order.
Mr. Speaker, what we are having here, sometimes I wonder if we're having a debate. This is a supplementary question. Members must learn to be able to formulate their question rather than have a 5-minute debate on each supplementary point. That's all I'm trying to say.
Honourable members, I have elaborated before that in submitting questions, they can put a preamble to the question when they're submitting it to the Speaker's office. And please bear that in mind also, again. I've given some leeway. Truth is, it is Private Members' Day. It is their time, they're taken up.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
But, Honourable Member, please bear in mind that it is, and a rules says your preamble should be short. The Premier is right on that.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, I agree.
There is hope for you yet?
You just don't try to attempt to do all that I see is going on this morning to make it any longer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The minister suggested that evaluations are subjective and that persons may not be necessarily happy with their evaluations because sometimes there are discrepancies on different evaluations in large margins and large percentages differences. Because of that subjectiveness, there's always opportunity for potential foul play. Hence the reason my suggestion to the government before of being involved in the process of regulation. Does the minister not recognize the seriousness of the effect of a malicious evaluator, especially with the industry being subjective, and the dangers that causes for Caymanian homeowners that they are not willing to get involved in the process?
Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First, let me deal with the rebuttable presumptions. The first one being that the government is not willing to get involved with a serious nature. This government, as in previous governments, Mr. Speaker, has always been willing to do what is of paramount consideration for its people, and by that, not just Caymanian, but all the residents who have their being here within the Cayman Islands, because out of many we're still one people. That's been the success story of the Cayman Islands jurisprudence. But secondly, Mr. Speaker, the nomenclature valuation in itself has an inherent connotation that it has to be subjective. Obviously, the tenants, the foundation tenants, would be based on their qualifications from the RICS, but there has to be an element of subjectivity. Hence the provision by the common law that a person can access the courts for remedy. And in fact, I think if we would cut the red tape and get to the gist of the questions, perhaps permit me, Honourable Speaker, to say that the million-dollar question is why valuations are supported by a perceived low price when the banks may foreclose them. And to be able to cut some of the preamble, let me just respond to that in anticipation of where the member might be wanting to take this question trail. When a bank takes a decision to foreclose on a property and to sell in order to recover its mortgage debt, they usually request 2 valuation reports to support the proposed sale price, and they must obtain a court order. It's not done arbitrarily to approve the sale. The bank has to follow strict protocol and foreclosure procedure, and this is not an easy one. The bank will require the valuer to provide a market valuation of the property subject to the foreclosing procedure. In this situation, Mr. Speaker, the bank is the client, and they provide direct instructions to the valuer. The owner of the property has no involvement at this stage because they're in default at this stage. The valuer only has a responsibility to their client, which is the bank, and it's the institution between the instruction between the bank and the valuer which sets out the terms of the valuation. Most often, the bank will require a market value subject to a restrictive marketing period, usually considered to be around a 6 months period. The value will be less than the open market value. And notice the difference of the valuations of the property. If the property have been marketed for a reasonable period, which is often considered to be a period exceeding 1 year, dependent on the property type and the prevailing market conditions. A market value subject to a restrictive marketing period is the value which a bank will rely on upon a foreclosing scenario. However, the bank's main concern will be to recover their outstanding debt. Before a foreclosure sale can proceed, Mr. Speaker, the bank must have the consent of the court via court order, and this is the balance of the subjective test. The courts in Cayman have an international reputation of doing what is fair and reasonable, and if for what reason the Grand Court fails to do that, there is the course of the Court of Appeal and on to the Privy Council.
Mr. Speaker, I just want to say thank you from the Minister That is a very extensive answer to the supplementary questions, and she went further and beyond questions that I've asked. But I think in her answers have highlighted a number of other problems that I cannot do supplementary questions from here. But I want to thank the Minister for giving me so many supplementary questions. I really appreciate it, so we can get to the heart of this problem. And I want to thank the administration for suspending standing orders to allow more than 3 of my questions to be asked. That is it for me today. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member for East End.
We're really wasting time on our day, you know. Mr. Speaker, I wonder if the Minister can confirm that all those in this country who are doing evaluations are actually qualified to do so.
Honorable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, if the evaluator is a RICS registered, they are to be qualified. If they're carrying out evaluation and they're not registered, then it's an illegal activity if it's a Caymanian, and the law would have to deal with that. Obviously, if they're here as a non-belonger and they're carrying it out, again, that's an immigration problem that needs to be enforced. And if the member knows that situation, I'll be happy to pass it on to Mr. Howell and those at immigration.
Mr. Speaker.
Member from East End.
Mr. Speaker, it escapes me how every real estate agent or firm in this country can be qualified. And I thank the Minister for saying if she would report it if I know of any, but she knows that I am very capable of doing that. Now that I know that the requirements are RICS, because there aren't many of those qualified in this country. It would be interesting to find out how many are registered with the local charter. Can the Minister say how many are registered with the local charter?
Honourable Minister.
Thank you.
Honourable Minister, this is the last supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I am informed that there's approximately 20, but the member would like to check and to confirm, and if it's different from that, we'll supply it in writing to the honourable member. But as far as she can recollect, it's about 20.
Mr. Speaker, if you would permit me just one.
Honourable Acting Member, Acting Leader of the Opposition. This is the last supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, I don't know if I missed the point, or maybe it was stated, but is it a requirement to be licensed in this country as an evaluator and also to be a member of RICS?
Mr. Speaker, I'm informed that there is not a specific requirement to be registered, but unless you're registered, you cannot conduct a Red Book valuation. Which also means that it would not be usable which would not be usable in court, so one balance out the next ones, really.
We have very well ventilated the matter, and we know that other members are taking objection to the asking of so many and such latitude given today. It is a very, very important matter. And as I have indicated, that was my last. Unless this is something that you can't, on leader of the opposition, you can't talk to the minister and discuss with the minister, then I would allow it. But if it's something that you can, let's, I think, stop at this point.
Mr. Speaker, if I promise to just have one more and stop, I think it's to the benefit of the whole House. My concern is not just the valuation values and so forth, but the ethics involved. I'm aware of situations where the bank has ordered a valuation, going through foreclosure process. Valuation has come back very low. However, the valuator has then put in an offer to the bank to purchase the property. Now, that is unethical, borderline criminal. And I think we need, I don't know if the minister would agree that we need some sort of framework that we can regulate that sort of practice, but that is wrong.
Honorable Minister, you care to answer at this point, or you?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, that is something the government is certainly willing to look into, because if all the facts is as stated, that certainly appears to be unethical and at the best a conflict of interest that should be preventable in the protection and preservation for the best interests of our people. So we would ask the technical staff to look at that situation. If you have the particulars, if you could perhaps just speak to Ms. Susan or David in the break, we'll be grateful for the information to see how we can take it further.
Honorable members, as I said, I know this is very important, and I say this publicly. I've been on the worst brunt of it myself, and so I was eager to hear some of the answers given and the undertakings given, and I quite understand government's point of view as well, trusting that members are now satisfied and we can move on to the other item.
Statements by the honourable ministers and members of the cabinet.
I have statements from the Honourable Deputy Premier.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this is a statement on Section 11.5 Appropriations 2018. Mr. Speaker, I rise to make the statement in accordance with Section 11.6 of the Public Management and Finance Law in relation to the Section 11.5 appropriations during the 2018 fiscal year. Mr. Speaker, EI1, Cayman Airways Limited, was increased by $7,500,000 in order to reduce the outstanding funds owed to Cayman Islands Airport Authority. These funds are the second half of the Cayman Islands government commitment to a $15 million injection to assist with Owen Roberts International Airport Redevelopment Program. Mr. Speaker, the appropriation EI-68, Ministry of District Administration, Tourism and Transport, was increased by $350,000 in order to install a GOESR ground station satellite receiving system at the Cayman Islands National Weather Service. This system is to be put in place in order to generate technologically advanced weather forecasting, severe storm tracking, space weather monitoring, and meteorological research. Mr. Speaker, the appropriation NG26, Miss Cayman Committee, was increased by $50,000 in order to fund Miss Cayman Committee ongoing expenses and the expenses for Miss Cayman Islands to attend the Miss Universe pageant in 2018. This increase was funded by a decrease of $50,000 from TP13 Miss Cayman scholarships. The request from past contestant winners to utilize the scholarship fund for 2018 can be accommodated. Mr. Speaker, TP67 Sports and Culture Tourism Programs assistance was increased by $370,000 in order to fund the Cayman Brac Island-wide cleanup program and fund ongoing cultural tourism programs. Increase was funded by $370,000 decrease in EA 125, Cayman Brac Emergency Shelter. Mr. Speaker, appropriation EA 60, Cayman Brac Bluff Playfield was increased by $200,000 through a transfer of $200,000 from EA 125, CB Emergency Shelter, in order to assist with items on the site of the recently constructed 25-meter competitive swimming pool in Cayman Brac. Appropriation EI 39, Tourism Attraction Board, Mr. Speaker, was increased by $100,000 in order to assist with the construction of the Children's Garden at the Queen Elizabeth Botanic Park. This increase was funded by $100,000 from decrease in EA 125. Mr. Speaker, the appropriation EI 68, Ministry of District Administration, Tourism Transport, was increased by $330,000 in order to assist with the procurement replacement of an aging fleet of vehicles, Public Works in Cayman Brac. This increase was funded by a $330,000 decrease in EA 125. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member from Easton.
Thank you, Mr. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I beg your indulgence to ask the Minister a couple of short questions on the 30, standing order 30 sub 2.
Member for Easton, please continue.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Speaker, I wonder if the Minister can clear up something for me, which is this additional $7.5 million to Cayman Airways, which is owed to Cayman Islands Airports Authority. Does that include the fees that Cayman Airways collected on behalf of the Airports Authority and was never redeemed by Airports Authority?
Honorable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the $7.5 million was paid to Cayman Airways and passed through to the Cayman Islands Airport Authority. The commitment that the government had given was that they were going to fund to early up the airport renovations, $15 million when we were in a position to do it, which allowed us to save time. So the money was paid into Cayman Airways, and Cayman Airways used it to pay outstanding expenses, bills, and accounts that were due to the Cayman Islands Airport Authority. So I believe that's your question is, was this money that was collected on behalf of the Airport Authority? And I don't have the breakdown in front of me, but there was a grouping of not only that money, which Cayman Airways obviously had, but also outstanding fees that was owed that has been historically built up over a long period of time of Cayman Airways losses. So
Mr. Speaker, I see
Member for Easton.
The Minister trying to answer my question, but I'm confused. You have further confused me now. I mean, that's okay. It's just a matter of clarification, really. Cayman Airways collects taxes on, what is $17? Or some airport authority tax, $17 per passenger or something like that it is. And that had amounted into millions of dollars because for one reason or the other, Cayman Airways had not paid it over to the airport's authority. So they spent that money. Now I'm asking if this is part of it, because that money has been used twice then by mismanagement or whatever of Cayman Airways. So I'm asking if this $7 million that they owe them now is part 7.5 is part of those taxes that were supposed to be surrendered immediately.
Mr. Speaker,
Honorable Minister.
I would take offense to the mismanagement by Cayman Airways in what the member just said. But the answer to the 7.5 million is yes, part of it was used to pay off the question of the fees that was collected. I can't tell you that all 7.5 million was toward those fees, but I'm assuming that part of it was, because it was an outstanding debt.
Mr. Speaker, I thank you, sir. I thank you. It's unfortunate that my good friend has taken offense to a very simple word that I said, but certainly if a company collects a coercive revenue, an entity collects a coercive revenue on behalf of another entity, like tourism accommodation tax, same thing. That is not your money to spend. Therefore, I can label that as mismanagement of funds. Mr. Speaker, I thank you, sir.
Honorable Minister of Financial Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise to make a statement about efforts which are being made by the government, specifically through the work of the Ministry of Financial Services and Home Affairs, to incubate innovation, attract strong and vibrant companies to our shores, and promote a new growing industry in the Cayman Islands in a safe, controlled, and prudent manner. Mr. Speaker, our jurisdiction has long been a world leader in the financial services industry. We have built a reputation as a safe, developed, and efficient international financial center, connecting capital from around the world, enabling capital projects, development, and innovation globally. Yet our financial markets are changing, Mr. Speaker. The global landscape is not how it was 30 years ago. New technologies are reshaping the way contracts are made, how capital is transferred, and how information is managed. Mr. Speaker, technologies like crypto assets and distributed ledgers give us more efficient ways to conduct business, but also bring new threats. They allow for capital and value to be transferred outside of traditional channels. They allow for anonymity in a new level of complexity, which most do not yet even understand. We should embrace change, Mr. Speaker, but we should do so in a responsible and prudent manner while continuing to embrace strict global anti-money laundering and terrorist financing standards. And Mr. Speaker, as an aside, the Attorney General will be bringing a committee stage amendment to the Proceeds of Crime Bill to address the concern in relation to this new innovative technology. Mr. Speaker, the importance of financial technology, or fintech, is quickly growing worldwide. According to available data, $57.9 billion was invested in fintech projects globally in the first half of 2018 in new technological advances like RegTech, InsurTech, process automation, artificial intelligence, robotics, smart contracts, or open banking. Attracting these companies to our shores, Mr. Speaker, has the potential to stimulate our economy and, most importantly, introduce new opportunities for educating our youth while providing new cutting-edge, challenging, and dynamic careers for them to thrive in locally. Mr. Speaker, many countries have enacted legislation quickly to be the first to jump the proverbial bandwagon. We, however, Mr. Speaker, have adopted as a government to instead take a steady, cautious, and prudent approach with the belief that what is worth doing should be done properly and with afterthought. Cayman welcomes innovation and wishes to provide a framework by which legitimate business can thrive on our shores. With this in mind, Mr. Speaker, the Ministry of Financial Services and Home Affairs has engaged various working groups and subcommittees which were comprised of key stakeholders and subject matter experts. In March 2018, the Cayman Islands Monetary Authority launched the Digital Assets Working Group. The working group was composed of an industry representative, personnel from the Department of Commerce and Investment, members of the Ministry of Financial Services and Home Affairs, and personnel from SEMA. Mr. Speaker, following receipt of the recommendation from SEMA's working group, and as per my request, the Ministry of Financial Services sought to garner feedback from those persons in industry in particular who use, create, and market new financial technologies from the jurisdiction. As such, in June, the Financial Services Legislative Committee's FinTech Subcommittee was formed. Through a series of consultations, these two groups agreed on the broad parameters of a framework that Cayman should adopt to promote and regulate new technologies such as crypto assets and fintech solutions. Mr. Speaker, new technologies are constantly evolving. The Ministry has recommended and the government has agreed that an adaptable, technology-neutral regulatory sandbox-type framework is the best approach for our jurisdiction. A regulatory sandbox, while welcoming new and existing innovative and pioneering companies, provides sufficient oversight and monitoring to ensure that activities taking place are compliant, fair, and transparent. This versatile approach would allow a regulator to observe new ideas, understand them, shape them if appropriate, and generate insights to feed back into mainstream regulatory activities. Mr. Speaker, it will encourage, foster, and incubate legitimate activities while adapting our laws and regulations on an ongoing basis as the need arises. Mr. Speaker, the Ministry is collaboratively engaged in the process of resolving the necessary legislative changes to implement this regulatory sandbox. Mr. Speaker, the government is also open to, and as a result, the Ministry is actively exploring how regulated digital ID systems could help revolutionize as well as streamline AML compliance locally and globally. So, Mr. Speaker, the Cayman Islands is a prime jurisdiction for technology companies to operate from, with excellent infrastructure, a world-class legal framework, and outstanding living standards. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, our recent changes to our intellectual property regime to include anti-patent troll provisions already gives technology companies an excellent reason to choose Cayman. And I'm reliably informed, Mr. Speaker, that these provisions are far too superior to many similar patent-related legislation around the world. So, Mr. Speaker, we aim to create a well-defined business environment that balances risk control and legislative flexibility to attract legitimate technology-based enterprises to our shore. So with your support, Mr. Speaker, and that of the members of this Honourable House as a whole, the Ministry of Financial Services and Home Affairs will work to ensure Cayman continues to remain at the forefront of financial innovation for future generations to come. And this is certainly the government's goal, Mr. Speaker, and has been the policy steer given to the working groups and the work being done to achieve such. Thank you.
Member from Georgetown Central.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I stand on standing orders 30 subsection 2 to ask a short few clarification questions to the Minister.
Agreed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Is the Minister, I think the summary of the statement was amazing, and I'm glad to hear the government is moving that direction. Can the Minister say, based on what she said, that has there been any applications for industries such as that to have a banking license or anything like that in order to have, what is it called, the crypto money, cryptocurrency, that's it. Thank you very much, members. Cryptocurrency in the Cayman Islands. Has there been any new banking applications for cryptocurrency applications?
Mr. Speaker, can I have a moment to confer with my staff on that?
Certainly.
Okay, Mr. Speaker, I have been reliably informed that there have been no banking license applications as such to deal specifically in the cryptocurrency, but there are fintech technology, or there's financial technologies that apply to banking. So just to make sure that there is no confusion in that regard.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just one more follow-up question. In paragraph 2 of the regulatory sandbox, the minister said the ministry is collaboratively engaged in the process of resolving the necessary legislative changes to implement this regulatory sandbox. Any idea on timeline on when some of those regulations and suggestive legislative changes are going to be brought to the House?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The information, again, that I've been reliably provided with is that the timeline for some of the known future changes, as I said, this is an evolving area, but for the work that's been done thus far, the actual timeline is going to be established at the next consultative group meeting, which is anticipated to be in December. So we'll have a better indication at that time.
Clark.
Personal explanations,
None.
obituary and other ceremonial speeches,
None.
raising a matter of privileges,
None.
other business, private member motions, private member motion number 3 of 1819, motion to introduce performance and
We can break. By the clock, it's 12:30. We'll break at this time for lunch till 1:30. Proceedings are suspended until 1:30 p.m. Isn't it p.m.?